My name is Di Hughes and I teach anatomy on the Bendigo campus. This is a series of videos to describe the anatomy of the central nervous system. In this video we'll describe brain anatomy and we'll consider the major functional areas of the human brain, and as you go through each functional area be keeping some notes about the general function of each area. To get started, I'll firstly ask you to watch this 2-minute animation of brain anatomy. Type this into your browser and it will take you through the basic location of major functional areas of the human brain. So now that you've seen that animation, these regions of the brain should be familiar to you. Take the time to pause the video and, with the help of your textbook to help with spelling, jot down the labelling names for these regions 1 through to 6.
On this model of an adult human brain, we'll look at the idea of cerebral hemispheres and various landmarks. So just to orientate you, this is the anterior side of the brain, and posteriorly this is superior and inferior. So the first thing to notice is the brain is divided into two halves called cerebral hemispheres, a right and a left, and there's a very prominent groove or fissure located in between them called the longitudinal fissure. Other things to observe are the folds of tissue called the gyrus or gyri, and the sulcus or sulci for plural, little grooves in between them, and these are important for landmarks to map various functional regions of the brain.
In general, cerebral hemispheres control the opposite side of the body. So the right cerebral hemisphere is responsible for controlling the left side of the body. And that's because at some point in the pathway, the neural pathway, the neurons cross from the right to the left. And we call this crossing a decussation, or we say that the neurons or the pathway decussate. So that's a term that you need to become familiar with. Each hemisphere is composed of several different lobes, and they're named according to the bone of the skull that they sit next to. And lobes that you will need to know about are called the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe.
On this model, which is positioned just as our previous model, so anterior and posterior, we can see brightly coloured regions of the brain which indicate different functional areas, and I'll give you an activity later in the video of identifying particular functional regions. So let's turn the model to look at a lateral view. So now this is the anterior and this is posterior. We can identify some different lobes of the brain, so frontal lobe, temporal, parietal, and then posteriorly the occipital lobe. So the different coloured regions indicate different physiological functions. So turning the brain around again, we can identify particular regions of the brain: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, brain stem, comprised of 3 segments, and the cerebellum.
So now that you've seen the model of the brain, you can take the time to label the lobes of the brain and the cerebellum on this diagram in your notes. And what we'll do next is decide how we distinguish between the divisions of the lobes. How do you know when the frontal lobe ends and the parietal lobe begins? So the next few images are cadaver brain images from your textbook, and I'll orientate you. Here's the anterior aspect and the posterior, and we're looking at a lateral view of the left cerebral hemisphere. We can identify the lobes we're familiar with: frontal lobe, parietal, occipital, and temporal, and the landmarks that distinguish the extent of each lobe is what we'll look at now. So we've seen the term already, gyrus, for the folds of tissue on the surface of the brain, and sulcus for the grooves of in between the folds of the brain. These are the landmarks that we use to distinguish the lobes. So we define the frontal lobe as ending at the area of the central sulcus, this prominent groove here. We define the frontal lobe as distinguished from the temporal lobe by the lateral sulcus, shown for you here. And the occipital lobe doesn't have such a prominent division, but there are anatomical landmarks that distinguish the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe. This is a superior image, and we can see again the central sulcus dividing the frontal from the parietal lobe. Here's our occipital lobe, and you get a hint that there is a reasonably prominent division of parietal to occipital lobes. Terms to notice: pre-central gyrus and post-central gyrus. These are important functional areas of the brain. This is an inferior view which shows the extent of the temporal lobe. We can see the brainstem and the cerebellum, and we can also begin to notice the location of cranial nerves that you'll learn about in the near future. So cerebral cortex has specialised functions depending on the region. Frontal lobe, in general terms, I want you to keep your study notes quite short for this topic. Frontal lobe, think motor control. Parietal lobe, think somatosensory, so sensations received and interpreted in the parietal lobe. Temporal lobe, hearing functions, and occipital lobe, visual functions. So this is a summary slide of some of the functional areas of the brain. Again, it's a lateral view of the brain, and we can identify the central sulcus, separating the frontal from the parietal lobe. We can see the temporal lobe here, indicated here. So in terms of the frontal lobe, we've just seen that the function in general is motor function. We can identify the primary motor cortex and the premotor cortex. Primary motor cortex you will recognise as the precentral gyrus region of the brain. The postcentral gyrus is involved as the primary somatosensory cortex. To distinguish between primary and association areas, the primary area is primarily responsible for the function, and association areas assist in carrying out those particular roles. Two extra areas labelled on the slide: Broca's area. Given that it's in the frontal lobe, you should already think that it's involved in some sort of motor planning or motor patterns, and in fact this is the motor area for speech production. Wernicke's area, shown here in this dotted line, in the parietal lobe primarily and partly in the temporal lobe, is involved in interpreting the sounds of speech and making sense of the words that we hear other people saying. We can also see the occipital lobe having primary visual cortex and visual association areas, and the temporal lobe having primary auditory cortex and association areas relating to the function of hearing. So to test your understanding of this objective, take the time to complete the various labelling of the brain activities on the worksheet notes, and jot down a brief function for each brain region you are listing in the learning objective. Table 12.1 in your textbook will help you to complete these tasks. For further help, post any questions onto the appropriate forum, and as always, consult your study guide to make sure that you can complete the learning objectives for this topic.